Hello, everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Palavito. I'll be your moderator for today's show. And today we're going to look at the Trump plan. What is the Donald Trump economic plan for the next 4 years? Or is it a mystery? Or does he have anything concrete to say? And with that, we're going to bring in the former Comptroller General of the United States back with us again, the Honorable David M. Walker, to give us some insight of what the Donald is going to do, if anything. So your commentary, David, what's the Donald up to?
Well, Nick, it's good to be back with you after being off for several weeks. Well, first, let's talk about Trump, but I don't think it's fair just to talk about Trump. I think you have to talk about his opponent as well, Kamala Harris. But let's start with Trump. Quite candidly, neither one of the candidates have been specific enough about what they plan to do to try to be able to put our finances in order. You know, our debt to GDP is already too high. Our fastest growing expense is interest. It's already exceeded defense and Medicare and is growing rapidly. In addition to that, it's not just a matter of what needs to be done, but how do you get it done? And as you've heard me said before, both the candidates need to say three things. One, they know that we've got a serious financial problem. They'll make it a priority to address it. Neither one has said that yet. Number two, we need a statutory commission to engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, solicit input, and set the table for a tough vote where everything's on the table, but not everything is equal. Neither one have said that yet. And thirdly, we need a constitutional amendment that will limit how much debt as a percentage of the government we can take on, because that's the only thing that will bind current and future Congresses. Neither one have said that yet. But let's go back to Trump. Here's the top line. Trump wants to cut spending. Trump wants to cut regulation. Trump wants to minimize taxation. As an example, he wants to extend most, if not all, of the tax cuts that were enacted that are set to expire at the end of 2025. He's proposed some additional tax cuts, such as don't tax tips and not taxing Social Security benefits. Now, the problem with that is that will exacerbate the fiscal challenge, not help it. He's made a number of comments about cutting federal spending and cutting the size and scope of the federal government. One of the things that he said is that he wants to set up a government efficiency commission, and that Elon Musk has expressed a willingness to potentially chair that commission. There's no question that government has grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, is not operated for results, and there's no question that a lot could be achieved potentially through such a commission. But that's really talking about what government does and how government does business and who does its business, rather than dealing with how are we going to reform our social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure? What are we going to do to reduce and reprioritize discretionary spending? What are we going to do to reform the tax code to be competitive but generate more revenues as a percentage of GDP? He hasn't been specific enough on that. Now, he's also introduced the concept of tariffs. As you probably know, Nick, I mean, before we had the income tax, that was the money that we had to run the federal government. It was overwhelmingly based on tariffs. But before we had the income tax, the federal government was only 2.5% of the economy, and defense was a majority of the federal budget. Now, the federal government is almost 25% of the economy and growing, and defense is about half of discretionary spending, but 70+% of spending is mandatory spending. We've written a blank check and is on autopilot. So it's a totally different situation. Let me quickly talk about Harris. The big difference is, as I said, Trump wants to cut spending, reduce regulation, and hold the line on taxes. Harris wants to significantly increase taxes, significantly increase spending, and increase regulation. There's lots of details, But you can't get much more of a stark contrast between the two from a philosophical standpoint. But let me come back to where I started. Neither one have been specific enough, and neither one approach is fiscally responsible as stated. And therefore, I reinforce what I said before. All we can expect during an election season is not a lot of details about how they're going to reform things, not a lot of things that the math works. All we can really expect is they know we got a problem. It's a serious problem. They'll make it a priority. That's number one. Number two, they support the need for a commission to be able to engage the people, set the table for a tough vote. There's no way you're going to be able to make these decisions through the regular order on a piecemeal basis. That's totally unrealistic. And number three, that we must have a constitutional amendment because that's the only thing that will bind current and future Congresses. It's the only thing that will force the Congress to make tough choices on a recurring basis so that our future can be better than our past. So far, neither one has done that. We'll see what happens tomorrow night. But that's the intro.
Okay. I don't think you were going to see the politicians jump in on this, but our panel will. And we're going to bring in Rick Grosner.
So I have a question. 2-3 weeks ago, one of the first proposals that Harris floated was a $25,000 grant to help with down payment on a house for first-time home buyers. And immediately, like the MAGAs said, well, oh, great. Now the price of homes would immediately jump by $25,000. And I thought that doesn't sound right, but I don't know. I want to ask David Walker. This is my first chance to ask about that.
Well, I don't think that you could say that would immediately go $25,000 up, but I think that, you know, her proposal reinforces what I said. She wants to grow government. She wants to increase government spending. And by the way, that $25,000 would also apply to illegal immigrants.
Honestly,
I'm not kidding.
I cannot understand. I can't understand the mentality of Americans and the American government more especially, right? Yeah, Dave, look, I love you, Like I think you're awesome. I think we agree on just about everything. We don't agree on inheritance tax. I'm going to make it my life's mission to convert you to my way of thinking on inheritance tax. And when it comes to Social Security, I think it should be privatized. You think that it should be changed? You know, when I get to Virginia, I'll sit down with you and see if I can dissuade you otherwise. Rick and Dave, you don't think it's going to add 25,000 instantly to the price of houses? Well, it did with electric cars. Okay, but I'm responding to it. It did with electric cars, right? That they gave a subsidy to electric cars, and all the electric car manufacturers immediately put their prices up by the same amount as the federal subsidy. You know, economics, we all know this. It doesn't work this way. You can't just spend money like this. I don't get it. I don't understand it. As for the tax cuts, and I noticed that there was a comment made just before. I'm assuming it's from Kimberly, or maybe it's an official Pod TV position. I don't know. But let the 40% tax cut for the top 6% expire. Now there is actually some. There was an actor who came out and said, "Oh, you know, this is going to give those people a $70,000 tax cut, but it's not going to give it to the poor and the middle class." Yeah, because you can't give a tax cut to people who aren't paying the tax. All right. So this tax cut that we're talking about is going to put $70,000 into their hands. You know what? That's what happens when you have a topsy-turvy, top-up tax system. That's why having a really, really horrendously progressive tax system doesn't work. And then when you do cut taxes, everybody complains that you're only helping the rich, but that's because they're the ones paying the taxes. The top 5% or 6% of the United States pays like 65%, I think, is the statistics that I got from the IRS last time I checked, 65% of the taxes. So yeah, of course the tax cuts are going to disproportionately benefit them. And it's so interesting to me when I listen to Americans, rich Americans, middle-class Americans, and poor Americans. They all hate the tax system. They all think the tax system doesn't work and it's not right. I listen to Australians. Everybody, rich Australians, middle-class Australians, and poor Australians, hate the tax system in Australia. But as a percentage of the GDP, the United States, 25% of the GDP in taxes. Australia, 27% of the GDP. Who beats Australia? New Zealand. New Zealand has, or had, up till recently, flat rate taxes at 30%, no capital gains tax. And yet they raised more taxes as a percentage of the GDP than we did. You have a look at the United States and then compare it to its peer group. It has the most complicated tax system, the most progressive tax system across any of its peer group, and yet it actually raises less as a percentage of the GDP. So technically speaking, you're a low tax country, and nobody thinks that. Nobody would ever look at Nick's face. Nobody thinks that the United States is a low tax country because everybody hates the tax system. So why don't you just fix that instead of coming up with all of these ridiculous ideas and then saying, you know what we'll do to boost the economy when we've got an inflationary crisis? Let's go and spend more money.
Well, first,
Rant over.
we need dramatic tax reform. We need to make it simpler, fairer, more competitive. More people need to be paying something because over 40% of individuals who file tax returns pay zero income tax. And 20% of the people who file income tax returns actually get money back. You can give a tax cut to people who don't pay income taxes. It's called a refundable tax credit. And Harris wants to give more refundable tax credits. So we've got to have more people paying something. We can't have over 40% of people in the country not paying something towards the basic aspects of government, including national security, homeland security, et cetera. But the wealthy have to pay more. But we have to do it through comprehensive tax reform that ends up making the code a lot simpler, okay? And if you look, as you know, Shaquille, you've looked at American 2040, still a superpower question mark. There is a tax chapter in there that follows this concept, right? But we do, in the end, we have to have more revenues as a percentage of GDP at the federal level because the gap is too great. We've waited too long. Demographics, healthcare costs, and interest costs are eating our lunch.
Have we ever had
Okay,
have we ever had comprehensive tax reform? And if
Yes.
so, when?
86. In 1986, we had comprehensive tax reform, the Tax Reform Act under Reagan, and so there is a precedent for it. Unfortunately, people kind of want to do these nip and tuck things that really don't move the needle, if you will. And they do that both on the tax side as well as on the spending side. And that's what we're getting right now. Understand this. The base of the government is not acceptable. The base of the tax system is not acceptable. The base of spending is not acceptable. The base of the social insurance safety net is not acceptable. I come back to what I said before. The government's grown too big, promised too much, subsidized too many, lost control of the budget, and has undercut states' rights dramatically.
Dave, I don't want to come across as a fanboy. I think you know that I respect you immensely. I've actually bought over 30 copies of your book to give to friends of mine who are in finance and economics because I love what you've written in there, and in specifically in the tax chapter, which I was really looking forward to reading. The whole way through the book, I had to stop myself from skipping to it because I wanted to read everything. And I've read your book multiple times. Look, I agree with a lot of what you say there, even the tax bit, where I don't agree. But there is a couple of things I'll say. One, when you just make the comment that you can give a tax cut to people that don't pay tax, it's a refundable tax credit. Well, okay, we can call it that, but why don't we just call it what it really is? It's a bloody handout.
Yeah,
it's taking money from some people to give it to others. So just call it directly that. But secondly, when people say to me, especially Americans, more than any other country, Americans, when they say to me the rich should pay more, I say to them, okay, let's define that. Like when Biden says, we just want you to pay your fair share. That sounds perfectly reasonable. But can we define exactly what you want them to pay? At the moment, it's been a little while since I've looked at the IRS statistics, so these might be a little bit out of date. But the last time I checked, something around this mark, the top 10% pays 90% of the taxes. Pays 50% of the taxes, sorry. And the top 50% pays 90% of the taxes. If you've got the top 10% paying half of all the taxes to your federal government, and you say that they should pay more, okay, more. How are we going to rate more? Just more as an arbitrary figure? More as a percentage of the economy that they actually earn because they're disproportionately paying more than anyone else anyway, right? More as a percentage of their asset. But look, what are we talking about? I really, the United States, more than any other country, should be a country that actually champions its wealthy, that champions the people that are actually able to make a success of themselves. I know there's been a lot of distortion because of big corporations. Previous shows, we've had Kimberly and other guests that have come in and said, well, you people are really wealthy. Why should we listen to you? Well, okay, what should you do then? Listen to the poor to work out how to become rich? I mean, I don't understand this mentality of punishing the wealthy, especially the self-made wealthy, and then trying to take their money off them when they die so their kids don't get any advantage. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is not what the United States is supposed to be about.
Big footnote. You are correct that the top 10% pay over half of the income taxes. You are correct that the top 50% pay about 90%. This is off the top of my head of income taxes. But that doesn't count social insurance taxes. Social insurance taxes, you end up getting taxed on the first dollar of wages and self-employment income. And most people pay a lot more in social insurance taxes than they do income taxes. Clearly, the 40+% of people that pay no income taxes pay more in social insurance taxes. So the real question is, how are we going to reform the social insurance programs to make them solvent, sustainable, secure? People do get something for those social insurance taxes. They get Social Security and Medicare, all right? So they get something for it. But they're not contributing anything towards the basic operations of government: national security, homeland security, transportation, you name it, all of those things. That's not right. As you recall in the book, what we talk about is, let's dramatically reduce the number of deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions. Dramatically reduce it. Let's keep the top tax rate down to 28%. Top tax rate, okay? At 28%, let's tax capital gains the same as ordinary income, because wealthy people don't make their money on wages. They make it on investments, all right? They don't hold on. They don't have to pay social insurance taxes on investments. So there's still a differential there between investment income and wage and earned income, if you will. By the way, last thing, this is not my opinion. I'm not telling you what I think. I'm telling you what the American people, by a super majority, 82%, supported as a way to reform the code, including to reduce the corporate tax rate to 25% rather than 21%, which is where it is right now.
Okay, but the super majority of Americans may be misinformed. Let me just come back at a couple of points. I know you want to say something, like, let me just come back very quickly on a couple of points. So, firstly, Social Security, yes, I accept that that's being paid. However, again, if you look at your peer group around the world, these are considered not to be taxes, but like in Australia, it's called a superannuation payment, etc. So it's very, very similar elsewhere. I would say to you that the people who are at the top aren't paying it, correct, but they're not really benefiting from it either, right? The Social Security amount for those people is going to be so minuscule compared to their actual earnings. So the disproportionate benefit does go to the working class people.
Right.
Secondly, and I think a more important bit is, do I think that the Social Security system in the United States should be reformed? Absolutely. I think it's reformed in Australia, and I think ours is a lot better than yours. But from all of our conversations, you seem to be thinking that the best way to fix it is to reform something that's already broken. And I don't think that that's going to work. I think this is going to eventually be a problem. In 20 years or 30 years or 50 years from now, the same problem is going to exist because it was warned about by people like Milton Friedman 50 years ago, 70s and 80s. What I would say is, if you know it's broken and you know it's not working and you know that the actual return, if you have a look at the percentage return that people actually get, if they had taken that money and put it into something just as simple as a mutual fund that tracks the S&P 500, they would be better off. So why not just privatize the thing? Just scrap it. Because we know that government uses it as a piggy bank. We know that government does a terrible job at managing finances. Just get rid of it. It's not working. Honor the commitments that you've already got, and let younger people have the choice to be able to put their money, their retirement money, into other things.
There's something we have to consider in the United States. Then I want to go to Mark and then Rick, okay, who've had their hands up. You have to consider something called political feasibility. What can pass the House, what can pass the Senate, and what can gain the signature of the President of the United States. What you proposed may make sense to a lot of people. It is by no means politically feasible. It is a non-starter, okay? So, you can't ignore political feasibility.
So
All right.
what are the
Mark is first and then Rick.
Then Rick.
I'll be back in a moment.
Yeah, a couple of quick questions that I had for you, Dave. I'm so glad that you're back and everything, because this has been on my mind for a while and everything. I was shocked to find out how many people, including some that are in the lower class and everything along those lines, haven't filed or haven't paid taxes and all along those lines, because it was like a high amount of people that actually shocked me, and I forgot the number, but it was definitely significant. So I was wondering, what are some of the ways that we can do that? Because last time I checked, it's supposed to be illegal not to do some of the things that I saw and everything, but it seems like a lot of people are skating and everything along those lines. So I just wanted your thoughts around that, because when I found the figures, and I don't remember the exact figures, I just know it was some figures that was multiple teens and everything, and it was definitely high, and I was just wondering your thoughts on that. And also, Defense Secretary, which I know is a separate conversation, has said that a 6-month funding stopgap, because I know a lot of people are very much concerned about our military spending, and he has said, Lloyd Austin, that would be devastating to our military readiness. So I think that in the latest budget, he's afraid that if we put a freeze on the military, it could be problematic. And there's a couple other questions I want to get to, but I'll let other people speak. I wanted to hear your answers to those two first and everything.
Well, first, over 40% of individual income tax filers pay zero income tax. They pay social insurance taxes, but they don't pay income tax. And about 20% of individuals who file federal income tax returns not only don't pay any income tax, they get money back through primarily through the earned income tax credit and or the child care tax credits, which are refundable tax credits. Meaning even if you don't pay anything, you get the money. All right. What a lot of people don't realize is, the Trump tax cuts are controversial. There's some good things about them. There's some bad things about them. We're going to have to make judgments about what makes sense to extend and what doesn't make sense to extend by the end of 2025. But one of the things that doesn't get talked about very much is one of the things that Trump did is he significantly raised the standard deduction. And what that did is it took a lot of people off the tax rolls. So a lot of people that otherwise would be paying taxes don't have to pay federal income taxes now, because the system, was modified so that the standard deduction is a lot higher, both for individuals as well as couples. Now, with regard to defense, we have significant international instability today. We have conflicts in Ukraine. We have conflicts in the Middle East. We have potential conflicts in the Far East. We could have a whole show talking about this. If the Defense Department gets a continuing resolution, it means they get the same amount of money they got last year. They want more money. Congress is probably going to give them more money. But one of the things that we have to recognize the reality is the Defense Department has become a bloated bureaucracy, incredibly bloated bureaucracy. And one of the things that has to be done is it needs to have a bureaucracy BRAC, not just a base closure and realignment commission, but a bureaucracy BRAC. And one of the things that Trump has talked about, and that Elon Musk has expressed an interest in potentially being part of or chairing, is something called a government efficiency commission, which would take a hard look at the current size and scope of the federal government and make a range of dramatic reform recommendations in order to improve economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And in my view, also, in some cases, not for the Defense Department, but for other departments, devolve things. And an example of that would be the Department of Education, would be one example for that. But so yeah, the Defense Department always wants more money. But it's got a lot of opportunity to be able to economize. But to do it, it's going to take a special commission to get it done, because it's not going to get done through the regular order.
Can I
Rick?
ask one follow-up?
Yeah, you mentioned feasibility. What are 2 or 3 things that are feasible? Question 1. Question 2 is, do you think Musk is really the guy to do it? He's made a lot of, particularly with Twitter, terrible business decisions.
Well, the answer is, I think Musk is a brilliant guy. Okay. And I think Musk could be part of the commission. I don't think it's realistic for Musk to chair the commission because this would take a tremendous amount of time, and he's CEO of several other entities, but I think he could make a meaningful contribution. I think you also have to have people that have a lot of direct experience, not just in the private sector, but also the public sector. The public sector is very different than the private sector, okay? And one of the things that we talked about earlier is the issue of political feasibility. But, what is feasible to be able to get done? What can you get through the House, the Senate, and get the president to sign? That's not something that Musk is, I'm sure, very familiar with. But I think he could add a lot of intellectual capital into this. Did I answer your question, Rick?
The second one, the first one is what are a couple things that are feasible that you can imagine actually happen?
Well, first, if you look at the amount of the budget in the Defense Department that relates to the so-called tail, which is overhead, it's grown dramatically. And the more money you spend on that, the less money you have to spend on the tooth, which is the warfighting capability. So that's why you need a bureaucracy bracket to rationalize and dramatically reduce that overhead. So you free up more funds for the so-called tooth rather than the tail. Secondly, the compensation system for the military doesn't make any sense. There are 3 components of compensation: cash pay, current benefits, deferred benefits. In the private sector, number 1 is cash pay. Number 2 is current benefits. Number 3 is deferred benefits. All right. In the military, it's exactly the opposite. The least is cash pay. The most is deferred benefits. When you have an all-volunteer force and you have younger people who you're trying to attract to come in, and we're having a very difficult time doing that, you need to rationalize the compensation system to make it more reflective of what is necessary to attract and retain people today and tomorrow rather than what it was in the past. The third thing is that we have to recognize the reality that the nature of warfare has fundamentally changed, and that other than things that are below the surface of the water, everything that is above the surface of the water, whether it's on land or on sea, is visible, totally visible. And therefore, we're going to have to recognize reality and modify what things we're building and deploying for the future, as well as to recognize that we're going to have to go to more unmanned, autonomous vehicles than what we've had in the past. And so those are just 3 examples that I would give you off the top of my head.
Gotcha, Toby.
Dave, I am so happy you're back. I love it listening to you because anytime you're around, I love sitting back and listening. Even when we disagree, I really enjoy you around, man. Whenever you come to Durham, we gotta sit down, go to lunch one of these days.
I love to. Thank you for your kind comment.
But one of the 2 questions, one thing I do disagree with is that commission that Trump was talking about, because that sounds too much like what they're talking about in 2020 in Project 2025 about just removing people and throwing in. But that's a whole nother discussion. The 2 things that dealing with what you were just speaking about war, where the internet itself has that the pipes that go up under the ocean and everything. Right now, Russia is is threatening those areas, which would cause a catastrophe economically, globally. So I would love to know your input on that, as well as one of the big things that is being talked about right now, of course, is tariffs, because I disagree with Trump's blanket tariff plan, but tariffs are necessary. you explain it beautifully. So I'd love for you to put some meat on the bone about why tariffs, in terms of utilizing tariffs in negotiation tools, economic wise, is a good thing, but using it as a scalpel and not just a blanket. So I would love to hear your comments around that.
All right. First, tariffs. As I said before the United States had an income tax, that's how we funded the federal government. We funded the federal government with tariffs. All right. But the federal government was 1/10 the size that it is now. And 97% of the federal budget was determined every year. The only thing that didn't have a cap on annual spending was interest on the debt, because we couldn't put a cap on that. We had to pay market rates. All right. We're in a totally different situation now. Tariffs, in my opinion, they don't represent a tax, but ultimately individuals end up paying for the tariffs. Having tariffs across the board as a way to fund the federal government is not realistic today. Okay. On the other hand, being able to use tariffs on a targeted basis in order to try to help level the playing field where there are inequitable practices that are being done that harm the U.S. workers. I think in those circumstances, they should be considered, okay? And you also have to keep in mind that it won't necessarily increase prices, because it could be that people don't end up buying those things anymore, okay? And so, but ultimately, consumers end up paying the cost of tariffs. It's not a tax, but in the end, they're the ones that end up paying the cost of any tariffs. But then they have to make a decision about whether or not they think it's good value for money. For example, if we end up putting tariffs on selected goods coming from China, not everything coming from China, but selected things coming from China, like e-vehicles, all right? Well, they're going to have to compete with other e-vehicles that don't come from China. And the tariff could make them non-competitive. So therefore, they can't sell their vehicles in the United States. And so somebody will buy something else because they think they can get a better value for money. Then the question comes back to something that was raised before by Shaquille. Do the other automakers decide they want to raise their prices? Okay. Then ultimately the consumer has to end up paying anyway. So it's but across the board to me does not make sense. Thinking that's how we're going to raise, going back to the future does not make sense, but on a targeted basis can make sense. That's my view. Yeah.
The tariffs, to me, that they sound like a good idea on the surface. I don't think that is a good alternative for raising revenue for a government. Targeted tariffs, yeah, okay, I agree with that. I'm not actually going to go with, you might be surprised to hear this, I'm not going to go with the idea that targeted tariffs in order to protect American workers is a good idea, because from what I have studied of economics, I don't think that works very well. I do want to come back, though, Dave, if I can, to something that you said before. You talked about political feasibility. To be fair, and I'm not trying to attack you here, you're talking about having a constitutional amendment. You're talking about reducing taxes below a certain rate or having flat taxes. Politicians, and you obviously have a lot more experience of American politics than I do, the politicians don't like giving up their power. One of the good things about high tax rates, that gives the politicians the ability to give people exemptions and all sorts of other things. I think that that's a very difficult road. I would say that when it comes to political feasibility, you plant a seed and you advocate for it for long enough and hard enough. Eventually, people put the pressure on the politicians to make changes. There's all sorts of overhauls that politics in general and government should actually have. I fully agree with that in your country and more importantly to me in my countries. But I will say that if we're going to talk about Social Security or anything else, political feasibility, whilst it is an important thing for what we end up advocating for, I think we have to actually also acknowledge what we think is actually right. What is actually the right solution?
Yeah.
And if you look at Australia, superannuation was not a popular idea. It wasn't something that people wanted, but eventually it got put through. And I think that when you see similar systems to what we have here across Europe, you see a similar sort of system in Canada. At some point, maybe the American government should start considering it. And at some point, maybe it's not so insurmountable a challenge to actually get politicians in America to say, okay, this is the right way to go. And the way that I would argue it is because you actually already have obligations that need to be met. And because we also know that the returns that you will make on a private pension basis is going to be so much higher than what you're currently getting in Social Security, you could actually put a tax on the private pensions. Not something I would ordinarily advocate for, but you could actually put a tax on them. That would fund the existing obligations and leave the younger generation better off.
Well, let me mention a couple things. As you know from the book, we got well over 80% agreement on 6 reform principles to guide Social Security reform, tax reform, healthcare reform, defense reform, etc. Those principles are, number 1, pro-growth. We want pro-growth policies so that we can grow the denominator in debt to GDP faster than the numerator. We're doing the opposite now, so pro-growth. Secondly, socially equitable. We need a solvent, sustainable, secure social safety net for those who are truly in need, for example. Culturally acceptable. We believe in a free enterprise system. We believe that the capital, the engine of growth and innovation in the government is in the private sector, not the public sector. We believe in individual opportunity, and there's a limit as to how much we're willing to tax ourselves to stay competitive and to maintain that culture. Fourthly, mathematical integrity, reasonable assumptions, no funny business with regard to math. Fifthly, politically feasible. You got to pass the House, pass the Senate, and get the signature of the president. And then last, meaningful bipartisan support. If you can't get at least 20% of the opposition party, then it's not going to be sustainable over time because the margins are too close. All right. So those were the principles and values. On Social Security, as you probably recall from the Social Security chapter, it was a hybrid system. It was a base defined benefit and a supplemental defined contribution system. And I think that it's possible that over time, those ratios could change. But I think right now you could get bipartisan support for a hybrid system that is base defined benefit, supplemental defined contribution. All right. And I think you also could get support, political support, bipartisan basis for, diversifying how the trust funds are invested so there's a better rate of return than it is right now. But sometimes
you're absolutely correct. I just wish they overhauled altogether. But you're absolutely correct.
Just to remind you of one thing, though. Let me remind you of one thing. George W. Bush, Bush 43, okay, Bush Jr., tried to do Social Security reform based upon a superannuation concept. The support for his program was less after he did public education than before, because he forgot the second word in Social Security. It's security, not opportunity. And that's why I think that a hybrid system is the way to go. And we may or may not do something more than that over time, but for lots of reasons, I think the hybrid system is the way to go. The base defined benefit, supplemental individual account. Rick.
Bill, sorry. If I'm missing other people, it's because I'm on my phone, so I can't see your hands up. So sorry if I've jumped in. You're muted.
Rick, you're muted, buddy. You're muted.
You're muted, Rick.
You're muted, Mick. Rick. Okay, you're not unmuted now.
All right. Could the military budget be reduced by 20% without reducing military strength?
I
would advise against it. As somebody who's not American, I would advise against it.
I think first, you have to talk about how are you going to do it. I don't think that you want just an across-the-board cut.
No, but you talked about
what I'm saying is, well, let me give you my opinion. The tail, which is the overhead, can be reduced 50%. The tail can be reduced 50%. That will give you at least 10%. I don't know how much. How much more than that, I'm not sure. I haven't done the math on it. But you could significantly reduce the tail, and you could also rationalize future purchases to be more reflective of likely current and future threats and the type of systems that you need in order to fight future warfare rather than past warfare. And you could get to 20%, but you won't get that immediately. You could get there, yes, but you won't get there immediately because it takes time to get there.
Just really quickly, Dave, because you kind of alluded to it, and I know it's part of the reason that this network, meaning Pod TV, was founded and everything along those lines. What would you say, because I mentioned this on World Edition, the show before you and everything, to those folks that are concerned about their economic woes and everything along those lines? Because I know that they say that most people, if an emergency takes place, are not prepared to deal with that emergency. And the figure that I gave earlier today is that 29% of Americans are not prepared to deal with any sort of weather catastrophe, whether that's a hurricane or whether that's whatever. So that's 1 out of 4 people that aren't able to deal with that. And we've got hurricanes and tornadoes and all kinds of things and fires happening around the country. So what kind of economic policies could you see in place to help alleviate that?
Well, first, I don't know the exact percentage, but I think over half of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. Our savings rate is very low. And one of the reasons that I think we ought to go to a hybrid social insurance system is I think we need automatic savings on top of a base defined benefit programs to go into an individual account program because people aren't doing it on their own. I think, I come back and say that, one of the things we got to do is we got to educate people on financial literacy.
Right.
It should be mandatory before you can graduate high school. You understand the basics of financial literacy. And quite frankly, maybe we ought to make it mandatory for Congress because I don't think they understand financial literacy. I also have advocated many times, September 17th is our Constitution Day. We have it coming up. I've advocated many times that there ought to be a mandatory test on the Constitution for anybody who's taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and publish the results. I think we'd be shocked to see what the results of that would be. Oh, and by the way, coming back to something Shaquille said before, Shaquille, here's the good thing about our constitutional system. You talk about the difficulty in getting an amendment. You're right, but here's the good news. Our founders were very, very bright, and they had a lot of foresight. And they envisioned that at one time in the future, Congress might become so out of touch or out of control, or there could be certain issues where they had a fundamental conflict of interest, like controlling spending and debt, like term limits, like campaign finance, that they provided equal authority to the states to be able to have a convention of states to propose one or more amendments and cut Congress out. And by the way, The president has no role in constitutional amendments, okay? And guess what? I'm working on an effort right now, and I've got another board meeting this afternoon where we are supporting the efforts by the states to sue the Congress for failure to call a convention of states to propose a fiscal responsibility amendment because we passed the required number of states in 1979 and Congress never did anything.
I've heard you talk about this before, and again, not my country, but I know so much about America, and I absolutely 100% agree with you, and I really hope that you actually get that done. Rick asked a question about cutting defense spending. I think that's a really bad idea. The United States spends around 2.5% of its GDP, as it did 200 years ago, on defense. If anything, I would actually advocate for it to go up, not down.
We're about 3% now.
3% now, okay. Your equipment's out of date. There's some issues there. So I actually think the defense spending should go up. And I think as a percentage of GDP, it's not much, especially for a country that has so many diplomatic ties, so many foreign missions and bases. I think that'd be great. I do want to just come to something you said before about equitable. The number 2 thing you said which was equitable stuff. And Rick and Mark, I think just made comments about a certain percentage of the population. Nick said this last year and the year before that half the population doesn't have $400. Yeah, but what do you want? What's equitable? I'm not American, but if I was, you want me to pay for it? Because if I give them $400, they're just going to go and spend it. That's what everybody keeps saying. Give the money to them, they'll spend it. So what am I supposed to do? Just keep giving them $400 every time they spend it? Right? Like, people make choices. And I don't think it's equitable that if I'm working harder or smarter or making money from something and someone else isn't because they've chosen to do a different job, that I've got to give them the money. Well, how about you force them, if you really want equity, how about you force them to work the hours that they do? Right? What do we mean by equity?
It doesn't mean,
Equitable.
but there's a difference between equal opportunity and equal result. And the issue that you're talking about is one of the reasons why I think guaranteed minimum income, will not pass in the United States. Jacoby?
My question, I guess, kind of ties into Rick's 20% or cutting. Trying to think about, and Dave, you and I are completely agree. We're fighting old wars. We need to look into the future about what's coming and how wars are going to be fought in the future. And when we're talking about unmanned aircrafts and so on and so forth, with the increase with AI and all that, one thing Rick always talks about, and he and I are in sync on this as well, AI is going to take a lot of jobs. And with that could be part of that 20%. However, I guess my question goes to, with the loss of the jobs based around AI, not only in defense that's going to happen, but also in energy, all the other cultural hot button issues, what is your advice? How are we going to be able to educate people in a way to understand that they've got to shift their lives away from the old past of, hey, we don't need to ride in a cart in a coal mine anymore. We have to use this robot and teach people how to use this robot. Culturally, how do we get in people's minds to understand the future is coming and we have to change?
Well, the bottom line is we're going to have a significant education and retraining effort. AI is going to have positive aspects for us and negative aspects for us. To the extent that people are doing things that don't require a lot of innovation or value added, they're doing things that are very rote that can be replicated or whatever. They're more susceptible to being dislocated. Just as they are with regard to other technologies, such as robotics and things of that nature, okay? And so that all comes back to education and retraining, if you will. But it also comes back to, our immigration policy. We need immigrants, but we need immigrants that are based upon what the macroeconomic needs of our country are in order to be able to grow, in order to be able to remain competitive, and in order to to be fiscally responsible, if you will. And so, good question. Thank you, Jacoby. Rick?
Yeah. If you take constitutional reform to the states, are crazy states a worry?
Here's the deal. Okay. You have to have 2/3 of the states file active applications before you can get a convention. In 79, we had 39, of which 30 were fiscal responsibility only, 8 were plenary, meaning we want to get together and talk.
So why didn't it happen
because Congress never assigned responsibility for anybody to receive, store, and count the applications. So it was an omission. We can debate whether or not it was intentional or not, because the Congress doesn't want there to be a convention because it shows that they've failed and they won't have a seat at the table at the convention. Because the reason there's a convention is because they didn't do their job, right? We reached a peak in 83 where we had 40 states, only need 34, keep in mind. Of the 40, 32 were fiscal responsibility only. So the key is, it should have happened. A majority of the states, not just a majority of the applications, a majority of the states wanted fiscal responsibility only so they can confine the scope of the convention to fiscal responsibility. If a majority of the states come up with a proposed amendment, not 2/3, a majority, they send it back to the states. There's two ways to ratify. We advocate for the second, which is state conventions of delegates pledged to vote for or against the amendment. That's the closest thing you can get to a referendum in our country under our constitutional system. That was what was used to repeal prohibition, which is the 21st Amendment. It's the
Best
closest
one you've got.
It's the closest thing to what Switzerland did to get 85% of public support to implement the Swiss debt brake. That's the way forward, and that's what we're fighing for.
Hey, Dave, is it
The 21st Amendment is so much better than the 18th, let me tell you. But the couple of things there, Jatopi and many others have made mention this before about the displacement of jobs because of AI. I don't know. I tend to disagree. I hope that I'm correct, that it's not going to displace jobs, because I think that other technological advancements that we've had have worked quite well, and haven't really displaced people on a macro level. I do want to just say something about education. So you made a comment a few weeks ago when I was on about actuaries and how hard the course is. Now, I've got the ability to sort of speed track myself through that because I've got recognition of prior learning for a whole heap of other things that I've done. And so I started looking it up, and I just thought, maybe I should do it. I've always thought about doing it. So I thought, I wonder what's required to actually get in. Well, I've got the qualifications. I can do the course. I thought, okay, well, let me have a look at actually what the course units are, and some of it's like calculus and this and that. I'm like, oh God, I hated that when I was in year 9. Like, I don't want to do it again. But, fair enough. Those are the modules. But I was fascinated by the first module at the 5 universities over here in Australia that offer a Bachelor in Science in Actuarial Sciences or a Bachelor of Actuarial Studies directly. The very first module is Indigenous Affairs Studies. Nothing at all to do with mathematics. So I rang one of the universities just for a laugh, and I said, hey, can you tell me how that's going to help me to be an actuary? Most people that go into actuarial studies are like mathematics nerds. They're socially awkward, like accountants, Dave. So I'm thinking, like, why would you need to study this? And I'm just fascinated. Like, yes, we do need to educate our young people. We do need to give people educational opportunities, but it's just been hijacked. It's been hijacked in ways that really doesn't result, as far as I can see, in a better quality professional in that field. Now, I'm using an Australian example, but it's very, very similar. I looked up the course in the United States. Very, very similar over there. Why do that? I think if we're going to reform government, we should reform all of these major organisations. And I think that an audit of everything, including here in Australia, we spend, the equivalent in your dollars of like $400 billion on Indigenous issues here. We need to audit everything and find out where the money's going and cut down on some of the waste. And we need to actually hold some of these public institutions accountable for what they're forcing people to spend money on.
Well, first, the U.S. government doesn't have a strategic plan. The U.S. government doesn't have key national indicators that would end up determining how are we doing? Are we making progress? How do we compare to others? And one of the things that has to happen is that those need to be adopted. And then we'll be in a position to be able to make more intelligent decisions with regard to appropriations, with regard to oversight, with regard to reauthorization. Then we'll be able to hold people more accountable for results. Right now, in the absence of those things, people measure success by how big is their budget, how many people do they have, how many regulations did they issue. Those are not metrics that are meaningful to the American people. What are meaningful to the American people is to what extent are you doing things that benefit the American people and or the country in areas of economic security, national security, international stability, domestic tranquility, etc. So that's one of the things that has to happen that I've been fighting for a long time, and hopefully eventually we'll get it. But let me just say one last thing. We have 3 kinds of actuaries. We have enrolled actuaries, which has to do with the IRS. That's the lowest, the easiest to get, okay? We have associates of the Society of Actuaries, where you have to have a number of qualification requirements, experience requirements, and pass 5 exams. And then we have a fellow of the Society of Actuaries, where you have to do the same thing but pass 10 exams. The pass rate for people of getting a fellow for Society of Actuaries and the number of years that it takes to get it is the longest of any profession by far, the longest and lowest pass rate of any profession by far. That's the basis of my comment. That's just the U.S.
Hey,
I
David,
wasn't trying to big note just because of the qualifications I have. I could become an investment actuary because I've already got qualifications. It wouldn't take me as long. I've already got experience, so it wouldn't take me as long. But that I was just making a comment about the
I
indigenous.
passed the 10 exams, Shaquille.
hey,
Oh, you'd be surprised at how many things that I passed, Dave. I'm not just a pretty face.
no, but Dave, just really quickly, on the same lines and everything, just really quickly, Dave, is it part of the problem that it's not just a federal issue, some of this over-bloated government? Because I was just actually at my dad's significant other's house, and she was actually she stepped away from a board that she was on because of a family conflict, because one of the organizations is an organization that I'm involved with, so it was a conflict of interest for her to go after the money. But before she got off that board and everything, she talked about the nature of these rules and regulations, so that people are getting like this money proposals with no real guidelines. So they're like writing these massive proposals that make no sense and everything, and they are very much over-bloated reports and everything, and that's on a local level.
Yeah, it's a problem. It's a problem at the federal, state, and local level. And let me bring it back to a macroeconomic number that just came out. We just came out with numbers for employment. The number of jobs that were created in August was less than we expected it to create. More importantly, there was an over 800,000 reduction in the estimated jobs created for earlier this year, which is obviously a matter of concern. But the biggest surprise that a lot of people didn't focus on is, guess where the jobs are being created?
Where?
Government.
Yep.
Over half the new jobs are in government. Okay. In addition, illegal immigrants are getting jobs faster than Americans are getting jobs. These are below the macro numbers that just came out that typically don't get reported on.
But just like
Dave, just on those jobs numbers.
Wait. We have a little bit of a problem here. We're out of time. So I thank the honorable.
Can you hang around for a second, Dave? I was going to say something real quick.
General of the United States.
Hang around backstage. I'm going to say something real quick, Dave.
Continue.